Imagine this scene. You're deep below the Egyptian sands in a chamber lit only by torches. The year is roughly 2200 BC. You're a young soldier roused at midnight with cryptic instructions. Bring honey, 10 jars, and speak to no one of your destination. Phocas is a boy king who reigned so long that the pyramids of his youth were already ancient by the time he grew old. He's usually introduced in textbooks with one impressive statistic. Pepi II Neferkar is credited with the longest reign of any monarch in history, somewhere around 90 years. But naturally, the story is more complicated. Ancient Egyptian scribes liked to round numbers up, and kings liked to exaggerate. Still, it was a very, very long time for one person to hold the throne, and that does strange things to both a kingdom and a personality. You'll also hear Pepi described in modern blogs as the most perverted pharaoh in history. That phrase is clickbait enough to make you expect lurid scandal. The reality, as usual, is subtler and perhaps more telling. It's a story about a lonely child ruler raised in an echo chamber of absolute power, who grew into a ruler whose eccentricities, indulgences, and suspected abuses were whispered about for centuries. The perversion wasn't just sexual, it was political and psychological, a distortion of how a state should function, mirrored in how a man could treat the people around him. The pharaoh enters. He is 96 years old, some claim a full century, having worn the crown for 9 decades since childhood. 8 generations of his own bloodline have died before him. His name is Pepi II. Let's drift slowly through his life, like the slow current of the Nile. We'll visit his bizarre childhood, his letters to frightened officials, the rumors about his tastes, and the way his long, stagnant rule helped slide the old kingdom toward collapse. Nothing here is going to eep out at you like a mummy in a horror film. It will just seep in, softly, like desert sand creeping into a temple floor. A boy king in an aging kingdom, Pepi II came to the throne somewhere around 2278 BCE. Still a small child, perhaps only 6. Imagine that. You've barely lost your baby teeth, and priests are already kneeling at your feet, calling you Horus, Lord of the Two Lands. Of course he was. His father, Pepi I, had died, leaving a complicated set of wives and sons behind, and the court decided that this boy would be safest on the throne. Safest here meant easiest for ambitious uncles to control. He was technically the 3rd ruler of Egypt's 6th dynasty, an era when the Old Kingdom was showing its first cracks. Provincial governors, the nomarchs, were growing richer and more independent. Pyramid building was still happening, but on a smaller, cheaper scale. The aura of invincible divine kingship was dimming. Into that weakening system stepped a child wearing a crown too heavy for his skull. Naturally, the adults around him made it worse. His mother, Pepi II, acted as regent. She had been married to Pepi I and perhaps to his successor as well, which was not unusual for a queen navigating palace politics. She was shrewd, experienced, and determined to keep her son on the throne. In reliefs, she appears almost as large as the boy king himself, sometimes larger. A visual reminder of who was really running things. We can pause here, in the low light of our imaginary library, and notice a pattern. Dynastic oddities breed dynastic oddities. A child monarch is already a vulnerable figure. Surround him with ambitious courtiers, and you're effectively raising a future ruler in a hothouse of flattery, fear, and control. Pepi's reign begins like a fragile plant forced to grow around a trellis. The plant will never forget the shape. Pepi's letters to the outside world. One of the most vivid glimpses we get of young Pepi is a set of letters he sent to a desert official named Harkuf. Harkuf was a kind of explorer and caravan leader who traveled into Nubia and beyond, bringing back exotic goods and, occasionally, exotic people. In one famous letter, Pepi, still a boy, gushes with excitement about a dancing dwarf Harkuf has promised to deliver to the court. He orders Harkuf to guard the dwarf carefully, to make sure he doesn't fall into the river, and to hurry back so Pepi can see him perform. It's both touching and eerie. The most powerful child on earth pleading for a little entertainer, like any overindulged prince wanting a new toy. Later copyists preserved the letter because it was considered charming. Modern readers, naturally, find it a little sad. The same bureaucracy that recorded this also recorded Pepi's building projects and appointments. Over time, his inscriptions grow repetitive. He grants more autonomy to provincial nobles. He gives out more titles. He builds smaller pyramids. The long reign of the Child King stretches on, and Egypt's central power slowly leaks away like water through an old canal. The rumors of perversion. Where does the lurid modern label come from? We do not have a papyrus of courtroom accusations. What we have are hints, late-period traditions about Pepi's nightly wanderings, tales that he liked to dress in commoners' clothes and sneak out to indulge in things a king should not. A text called the Teaching for King Merikare, written centuries later, uses a story about Pepi to illustrate royal misconduct, how a king's personal corruption can corrode the state. There's also the simple fact of a long, stagnant reign. When a monarch rules for decades, his personal quirks become public policy. A fondness for lavish gifts becomes a drain on the treasury. An indulgence of officials' children becomes nepotism on a grand scale. By the end of Pepi's rule, the once centralized Old Kingdom was effectively hollowed out. To later Egyptians, he became a cautionary example, and the details of his perversion blurred into a general image of a ruler who had lost all proper boundaries. We don't have to imagine lurid orgies to see the harm. The harm was real enough in neglected canals, unpaid workers, and starving provinces, but the nickname sticks because the most perverted pharaoh makes a stronger headline than the monarch whose long mismanagement helped wreck a dynasty. Drifting toward collapse, Pepi's pyramid at Saqqara is small and poorly built compared to the giants of the 4th dynasty. Its walls are inscribed with pyramid texts, spells for the king's afterlife, but the construction itself shows how far standards had fallen. Even the titles of officials during Pepi's reign read like self-parody: hereditary prince, sole companion, overseer of the overseer of 10. Everyone had a title. No one had central oversight. By the time Pepi finally died, perhaps at a genuinely extreme old age, the country was fragmented. The first intermediate period began, a couple of centuries of decentralization and local rule. Pepi's long reign had become a kind of bridge from Egypt's dazzling old kingdom to its troubled adolescence. For our sleepy purposes tonight, there's no need to rush to the end. Just picture the child king grown old, sitting in a crumbling palace while ambitious governors carve up his realm, still being addressed as son of Ra, while his power ebbs away. That image tells you more about perversion than any sensational rumor could. A quiet reflection before we continue. So far, we've glided over Pepi's childhood, his eager letters, and the way his reign embodied both privilege and decay. In the next section, we could drift further into the specifics of his court, the roles of his half-brothers, the religious shifts, and the way the cult of the king subtly transformed under a ruler who outlived his own mythology. But for now, keep that soft picture. A small boy crowned too early, then an old man ruling too long, and a kingdom slowly losing its seed, Hape, under the weight of his name. It's an image of power stretched past its natural span, warped into something both tragic and, yes, a little grotesque. Drifting further into Pepi's court, we left Pepi as both a child king and an elderly monarch, two ends of a long, oddly shaped line. Let's float now into the middle years of his reign, when he was no longer the novelty boy on the throne, but not yet the frail old man in a fading palace. This is the part of his life where we find the most telling contradictions. He presided over a court that still performed the full ceremonial of divine kingship, complete with processions, temple building, and the daily ritual of feeding the gods. Yet much of the money and manpower for those rituals now came from regional governors rather than the central treasury. In effect, Pepi had outsourced his own divinity. Naturally, that created headaches later. On official reliefs, he still appears youthful and idealized, the standard Egyptian artistic shorthand for eternity. But behind those images was a very human court with squabbles, jealousies, and the slow erosion of central authority. In a way, Pepi's palace was like a stately home whose facade is kept freshly painted while the timbers rot unseen. The women of the court. One subject later gossip loved to circle back to was Pepi's domestic life. He had several wives, most drawn from the extended royal family. That was normal for the time, but always risky. The pool of acceptable spouses was small, and so inbreeding and internal rivalries were built in. Reliefs and inscriptions show queens and princesses with familiar names, Ankhes and Pepi, Neith, Ujipton, like a carousel of the same few families. In these names, we glimpse dynastic oddities. A queen could be both an aunt and a sister-in-law. A princess might be married off at an age we would now find shocking, because dynastic continuity trumped personal readiness. The quiet palace corridors would have been full of children in heavy jewelry, raised with adult titles but very little power. It is not hard to imagine how such an environment shapes a ruler's view of women and family. Later texts hint that Pepi's attitudes towards his queens and concubines became unseemly, though without specifics. Even if we ignore the lurid rumors, we know that the royal harem in this period had become a political arena. To control the women was to control potential heirs. Pepi's very long life meant his younger wives could find themselves locked in a kind of perpetual waiting room, their sons eclipsed by older half-brothers or cut off from succession altogether. Courtiers and their petty meltdowns. Another feature of Pepi's reign, again very modern in feel, was the inflation of court titles. If you couldn't offer an official real power, you gave him a grander name. Overseer of the granaries became overseer of the granaries. Nomarchs styled themselves hereditary prince in ways that would have been unthinkable under Khufu or Sneferu. This may seem like a minor administrative quirk, but titles meant local authority, and local authority meant tax revenue drifting away fee. Rom Memphis. Imagine a civil service where every regional manager is suddenly calling himself deputy king and acting accordingly. That was Pepi's Egypt. At banquets, the courtiers probably still wore the same linen kilts and perfumed cones, but under the surface, the old hierarchy had inverted. Each official's petty meltdown, each whispered complaint about neglected canals or unpaid temple rations, was a tiny crack in the facade of the old kingdom. The king's nightly wanderings. We come now to one of the most persistent later stories about Pepi, that he slipped out of the palace at night in disguise to indulge in whatever took his fancy. The earliest surviving mention is centuries later and clearly moralistic, meant as a warning to future kings. We have no contemporary papyrus saying, "Caught the king sneaking out again." But the story endured because it felt plausible. Here was a man crowned as a child, surrounded all his life by ceremonial and deference. Wouldn't such a person crave a kind of secret normality? Modern psychologists might call it thrill-seeking, or simply the boredom of too much power. The later scribes framed it as vice. We can also read it as loneliness. In our quiet retelling tonight, we don't need to decide which version is true. We can simply picture the image. A king slipping out into the night while Memphis slept, the stars bright above the desert, perhaps hoping to feel like an ordinary man for an hour, perhaps not. An old man in a young man's throne. By the time Pepi had been ruling for 6 or 7 decades, he was effectively a living relic. Generations of officials had come and gone. Children born at the start of his reign were grandfathers by the end. The rituals at court continued, but now felt automatic, like a metronome clicking long after the music has stopped. His later building projects were modest. His pyramid complex at Saqqara, built of smaller, poorer stone. It still bore the full pyramid texts, the magic to get the king into the afterlife. But even the quality of the carving was lower. The workforce had been cut. The treasury was thinner. When Pepi finally died, the machine of the old kingdom did not so much stop as sigh in relief and drift apart. A soft pause. Let's stop here for a moment. You can imagine the Nile at night, black water sliding under starlight, the palm fronds motionless. In a palace on the riverbank, an old king lies awake, perhaps remembering the day a caravan brought him a dancing dwarf, perhaps not. Outside, nomarchs and priests are already preparing to carve up his legacy. This is the texture of history that rarely makes it into the textbook chart of Dynasty 6. The human awkwardness, the small choices that add up to collapse, the irony of a child king who outlived his own system. In the next part of our gentle wander through Pepi II's world, we can drift into how his reign shaped the first intermediate period, how myths about his perversions became moral lessons for later kings. For now, just let the image settle. Pepi II, longest reigning pharaoh, possibly the loneliest, a figure of rumors and records, his name carved in stone, but his true self lost to time. The sands cover his pyramid, the Nile keeps flowing,